The South African National Defence Force is as vulnerable to cyber attacks as any other organisation, and that is a warning from cybersecurity analyst Dr. Kyle Bester. He says training and education should be offered to officers and the necessary technology purchased. To discuss this further, we are joined now by Bester, who is also a research psychologist. Thank you so much, Dr. Kyle, for your time this morning. A very good morning to you. Let's talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities within the SANDF presently. They themselves have said that, unfortunately, the resources are never enough to be able to capacitate, especially those that are within the SANDF. But then we're adding on another component where the world has to catch up to, and that is cybersecurity attacks, one of the biggest forms of attacks, particularly in a vulnerable South Africa. How is it, and what has the research actually shown you regarding the vulnerability of the SANDF in that regard?
Well, my research showed that military members are not isolated from society. They're very much entrenched within society as a whole. So you and I do internet banking. We are connected to our social media platforms, but so are military members as well. So the difference between the civilian and the military member is that they are exposed to sensitive information. They have access to sensitive information. And I think therein lies the bridge or the vulnerability, specifically if you have to link it to the human element or the human factor, which causes the military member to be vulnerable, in the sense that the moment they share or take their personal device, take it to work, they also use that information or that device to actually put sensitive information on that device. So if you go with that example, it actually poses the military member in a very vulnerable position. And sure, training and awareness is a very important element to actually create cybersecurity awareness.
Yeah. But then on the other side of it, I mean, Kyle, lots of research has gone into how South Africa still is very vulnerable to cybersecurity attacks. I think billions are being lost, if not hundreds of millions are lost every single year due to some kind of cybersecurity attack, We've got the normal ransomware, and you've got, I'm going to hold your information and then in exchange for some kind of Bitcoin. And this has been happening for years on end. But it looks as though the smarter the criminals get, our tech infrastructure is not necessarily rising to the point where it's completely preventable. Are we an isolated incident in terms of the country and their vulnerability, or is this something that is also a global phenomenon?
I think this is a global phenomena, especially during the pandemic period. You saw that cyber threats increased, and that's largely due to remote working as well. But I definitely think it's not an isolated incident. We're definitely seeing it more and more in the South African context, where you see that your government agency are currently, being attacked. If you look at the recent example a couple of months ago about a Transnet event, where you saw that the port network was essentially hacked. So that also puts the SANDF in a very critical position, because you have to look at the National Cybersecurity Policy Framework. It actually addresses that the SANDF is responsible for the coordination of cybersecurity efforts in the country. So that also fits into the idea of addressing the vulnerability of the critical infrastructure in the country as well. But if you break it down from the top level to the bottom level, the human element is most at risk. So if you look at the cybersecurity kill chain, the human element is it's essentially the weakest element in that particular chain. So it's necessary for the constant element of adapting and sort of developing your knowledge on cybersecurity threats, but also the potential attacks that you may be prone to.
So we're often seen as a neutral country, whether or not, we always take the diplomatic route, so as it were. But when it comes to the South African National Defence Force, as well as its role in the country, it's the first line of defence of our sovereignty, of our state, and the people, basically. And I'm not lying. If I were a criminal, I'm not one. But if I were a criminal and I was a terrorist and I wanted to attack this country, the first thing that I will do is shoot at the military, and I will do so using cybersecurity threats, because in that way you're blocking out intelligence, you're blocking out any form of retaliation, so as it were, and you're utilizing technological advances to do so. It seems also as a no-brainer there. But our military, A, is there political will to be able to capacitate our military so that they are equipped enough with that cybersecurity skills? And B, I can imagine it's quite a costly exercise to be able to capacitate any form of military so that it can be the best form of defense, especially when it comes to a cyber attack.
I think there are two elements to that particular, to answer that particular question. I think it's one, the continued budgetary restrictions or the budgetary cuts that the SNDF is experiencing is making it increasingly difficult for the elements of training and development of course material or education to actually be constantly incorporated into your basic training material, especially when members enter the organization. So that's the one issue. The second element is that the South African National Defence Force has elevated the idea of cyber threats. If you look at the minister's speech from the budget speech from 2018 until, let's say, 2022, you will see that the SNDF has prioritized cyber threats and cyber attacks as an element of concern. So they've added it to the budget. There is a point of developing a sense of awareness. There is a point of developing the idea of this is important. The threat is elevated and the threat is serious. So we need to address it with the relevant measures. And I think the SNDF is currently in the process of developing that. But on the other flip side of the coin is cyber threats are emerging at a phenomenal pace. So we need to constantly update ourselves with our legislation, but also the type of threat information that we experience and that the threat actually entails. And I think that's the element, is that the pace at which threats are developing and the technology is developing is not necessarily aligned in how our training feeds into that aspect as well.
Yeah, hopefully at this moment in time when you and I are having this conversation, Dr. Carl, you've got the SANDF as well as its captains that are actually listening to it and seeing how they can best capacitate themselves. Carl, so much appreciated for your time this morning.